If I could tell you one thing about negotiating, something that would make you 10 times more powerful negotiator, it would be this. Be prepared to walk away from negotiations. If we pass the point in the negotiations where we're prepared to walk away, we lose in the negotiations.
You're about to be introduced to the most remarkable business skill. A skill that can work a dramatic change in both your business and your personal life. It's a skill that can bring you vast new success in your dealings with people on every level, with your superiors, your peers, your subordinates, family members, tradespeople, people you deal with when you buy or sell a house or car. We call this skill power negotiating, and you are about to hear from the expert who has taught this skill to thousands of business people all over the country. His name is Roger Dawson, and he has now recorded a 6-cassette program with all the powerful secrets that have made him one of the world's most sought-after negotiating authorities. Roger Dawson's program tells you everything you need to know to get anything you want in your dealings with other people. He explains the various kinds of power that are used in negotiating. He tells you how to use the negotiating tactics that make professional negotiators so successful. He tells you how to analyze and adjust to the personality type of the person you're dealing with. He even tells you how to decipher your opponent's body language and conversational cues. What you're about to hear, of course, is only the very start of what you can learn in the complete 6-cassette program. But even so, you'll find it's full of valuable information that you can start to use right away. Here, then, is Roger Dawson.
Hello, this is Roger Dawson. I wrote the book on negotiating. It's called You Can Get Anything You Want, but you've got to do more than ask. And you really can get anything you want if you'll just realize these 5 things. Number 1, you're negotiating all the time. Negotiating is not just for prison wardens or FBI agents or union negotiators. Anytime you're eyeball to eyeball, belly button to belly button, kneecap to kneecap, toe to toe with another human being, you're negotiating. And if you know how to do it right, if you know how to structure a negotiation so that the other people get what they want, but at the same time you get what you want, not only will you be a lot more successful in life, but a lot of the pressure and the stress and the friction will go out of your life. Number 2 is the realization that anything you'll ever want in life is presently owned or controlled by somebody else. Now, this is not 1849, where you could buy a sluice box down at the hardware store and head for the hills of California and pick up gold and become wealthy, because it is laying out there. Everything is presently owned or controlled by somebody else. Now, doesn't it make sense that we spend a little time learning how to get it, and how to get it in such a way that we're not dominating people, we're not turning people off, but we're turning people on to us because we know how to get them what they want at the same time as we get what we want. So we should all be spending an awful lot of time studying negotiating. Yet it's amazing to me how few people have. In 1985, my daughter Julia graduated from USC. She graduated from the business school, one of the finest business schools in the country, in fact. Certainly one of the most expensive. It cost over $50,000 to put her through that school. But she didn't get 1 hour of negotiating training. So she came away from it feeling that business had to do with reading spreadsheets and profit and loss statements and the mechanics of running a business. And what you'll find out is, what every businessman has found out, that the answer to good business is not in the mechanics, but the answer is in handling people, in negotiating with employees and suppliers and customers. The art of negotiating, so critical to you getting what you want. Number 3 is the understanding that there are some predictable responses to the maneuvers that take place in a negotiating situation. Now, I call these maneuvers gambits. Now, that's a chess term. It means any maneuver for advantage. For example, whenever you say yes to the first offer, you set up a predictable response. Let me have you tell me what those responses are. Let's say, for example, that you're interested in acquiring a used automobile. And the people are asking $10,000 for the car, which is not a bad price, but you say to yourself, well, I'm going to be a sneaky negotiator. I'm going to make them a super low offer. I'm going to take them an offer of $7,000. And sure, they're going to get angry with me at such a low offer. They'll probably throw me out on my ear the minute they hear about it. But maybe we'll end up splitting the difference, and it'll still be a good buy. But I'll take them a really low offer just to see what happens. So you go on in and you sit down with a husband and wife that own the car, and you present the $7,000 offer, and you wait for them to explode with rage. And what actually happens is the husband looks at the wife and says, well, what do you think, dear? And the wife says, oh, why don't we go ahead and take it and get rid of it anyway? What is your response when they say yes to an offer that you didn't expect them to accept? Well, I'm fairly sure that your first response would be, I could have done better. I could have maybe got it for $6,500 or $6,000. In actual fact, if you'd have taken them a $6,500 offer and they'd have accepted it, you still would have thought, I could have done better. A $6,000 offer, you still would have thought, I could have done better. You see, it has nothing to do with the price. It has to do with the way people say yes to you. What would your second response be if they jumped at an offer that you didn't expect them to take? Probably, there's something wrong with the car. There's something wrong here that I didn't figure out. Those two responses are so predictable that in seminars around the country that I've conducted, when I ask the audience for their responses to that situation, I always get those two responses in that order. So part of the art of negotiating, which we'll spend quite a bit of time on, is learning that there are predictable responses to the maneuvers that take place. And we'll cover these gambits in sessions 3, 4, 5, and 6. We'll go through 20 of these specific gambits so that you understand what's going on in the negotiation. The fourth thing that we need to learn if we're to get everything we want out of life is that there are 3 critical factors to every negotiation. We'll devote all of session 7 to one of those factors, the understanding of power, the understanding of what makes one person able to influence another person. This will be particularly critical to you if you're in any form of management. There are 8 specific components. We'll discuss those with you and show you how to react to them when they're used against you and how you use them to control the other person in the negotiation. In session 8, we'll talk about the other 2 elements that always affect the outcome of the negotiations, how important information is to the negotiations, and how critical the time element is. And the 5th thing we need to learn is that people are different, that we have to adjust to the fact that we have a specific personality style and that people with whom we'll be negotiating do, and when the 2 don't match, we have problems in the negotiation. And in sessions 9 and 10, we'll analyze your personality style for you. We'll show you how to adapt your negotiating style to the different personalities, and we'll show you how people negotiate differently because of their personality styles. And finally, in sessions 11 and 12, we'll wrap up with a discussion of body language and hidden meanings in conversation. I'm a firm believer in win-win negotiating. Instead of the style of negotiating that says that we should dominate the other person and outsmart them and trick them into doing things that they wouldn't normally do, I believe that negotiators should sit down and honestly work out their problems together and arrive at a situation where both of them can win in the negotiation. Now, your reaction to that may be, well, how on earth can that work? If I'm trying to buy something, I'm obviously trying to get the lowest price I possibly can for it, and if they're trying to sell, they're obviously trying to get the highest possible price they can for it. How on earth can we both win in the negotiations? So let's start out with the most important issue. How can we arrive at win-win solutions in negotiations? There's 3 fundamental rules here. Rule number 1 is that if you narrow it down to one issue in the negotiations, if you are indeed only talking about price, I agree with you. Somebody does have to win. Somebody does have to lose. But there are always more issues than that in any negotiation. It's fascinating to study some of the international negotiations that go on and see the mistakes that are made and the elements that come together to contribute to the solution or lack of the solution. Take the Falkland Islands crisis, for example. I paid close attention to that because, being from England originally, it was kind of the last great flourish of the British Empire. But if you look at that negotiation, the Falkland Island crisis, and you only see one issue, who occupies the islands, the Argentinians or the British, Of course, there has to be a winner and there has to be a loser. But in actual fact, there were many more elements than that in the negotiation, weren't there? There was the prestige of the two nations. There was the political futures of the two leaders involved. There are always many, many more elements than just the one element that are important in negotiations. So the art of win-win negotiating is to piece together those elements like putting together a jigsaw puzzle so that both people can win. So never narrow the negotiations down to one issue. At a seminar once, a real estate agent came up to me. He was very excited, he said, because he'd almost completed negotiating a very large commercial building. We've been working on it for over a year now, he said, and we're almost got it resolved. In fact, we've resolved everything except price, and we're only $50,000 apart. Well, I flinch when I hear things like that, because I know from now on, however much work he's put into it, now that he's narrowed it down to one issue, then there has to be a winner and there has to be a loser. And however close they may be, they could still be heading for trouble. So while we may establish momentum in the negotiations by finding a common ground on small issues, we'll talk about that later when we talk about negotiating gambits, never absolutely nail down all of the other issues so that you're narrowing it down to one issue. Rule number 2 that makes you a win-win negotiator is the understanding that people don't want the same thing. You know, we all have an almost overriding tendency to assume that other people want what we want, that what's important to us will be important to them. But that's not true. In fact, we all have a unique perspective of the world in which we live. There's 4.5 billion people in the world, and nobody sees things just the way that you do. And the assumption that they want what you want can never lead to a win-win negotiation. If I were to hold up my hand with the palm facing you and ask you to describe my hand and compared it with my description of my hand, we'd get two totally different descriptions, wouldn't we? But it's not a question of one of us being right and one of us being wrong. We're both right. We're just seeing things from a different perspective. This is one of those things that's so simplistic, it's so easy to understand, and yet it's so very, very profound. Half of the problems in the world would go away today if people understood that with very few exceptions, people are not right or wrong. They're just seeing things from a different perspective. This is very important to you if you are a supervisor. If you're a manager of any people at all, it's quite common for some of your employees to come to you with the heat on. They're in a temper, they're in a rage, they're threatening to quit possibly, and they're saying, here's the conflict, here's what we're arguing about. And their assumption is that one of them is right and one of them is wrong, and they've come to you for you to make a decision as to who's right and who's wrong. Now, that puts you, as we Americans say, between a rock and a hard place, doesn't it? Whichever way you go, you're going to lose one of them. If you just take the time to point out that it's not a question of one being right and one being wrong, they're just seeing things from different perspectives. In actual fact, two people can look at exactly the same thing, have different opinions about it, and both be right. You'll be able to diffuse a lot of the conflict which may arise in your organization. So rule number 2 that makes you a win-win negotiator is to learn not to fall into the trap of assuming that the other people want the same thing that you do. And probably the biggest trap that most of us fall into is assuming that price is the most dominant issue in a negotiation. There are many, many other elements other than price that are important to people. So number 3 is that the understanding that we'll never be a win-win negotiator if we think that they want what we want. Because if we make that assumption, we further make the assumption that anything we do to help them in the negotiations, to help them get what they want, takes away from what we want. Let me give you a couple of examples to illustrate this. I do seminars around the country for real estate investors, and part of my service to them is that I offer a consulting service. They can call me anytime they're involved in a negotiation, and I will help them out. I got a call from a real estate investor in Seattle who had located a piece of land that he felt would make an excellent shopping center development. And he could hardly believe his good fortune because he felt that the other developers must have just overlooked it. So he got together a group of investors who would be willing to syndicate the development of the shopping center, and he approached the owner of the land with an offer to buy. And what he ran into was absolute indifference to his offer. The person who owned the land didn't say it was a bad offer, didn't say it was a good offer. He just wasn't interested in discussing an offer on the property at that particular time. Now, this is always a big problem when you're negotiating. You're always better off to have a strong objection to what you're doing than you are to meet with indifference. At my seminars, I asked for the unmarried people in the audience to answer this question. What's the opposite of love? Invariably, the answer comes, hate. Well, we married people know better than that, don't we? We know that love and hate, when you're married, can be just that close. The real opposite of love is indifference. They simply don't care anymore. When they're throwing plates at you, you can handle that. But what's difficult to handle is when they're just not interested in discussing the problem. And that's the same thing when you're negotiating. You're always better off to have a strong objection than you are to meet with indifference. So I said to the Seattle investor, okay, quit telling me about the property. I know you're excited about it, but quit telling me about that, because the answer is never with the property. The answer is always with the person. Tell me all you know about the person. He said, well, I don't know too much. He's a very elderly man, evidently very, very sick, probably going to die within about a year or so, and he knows this. Very, very wealthy. Money is just not an issue to this person at all. And he's just not interested in discussing the sale of this land. Well, what might this person be interested in? If we get around the other side of the negotiating table and understand that we can do something for this person that will not take away from our position because we don't want the same thing in the negotiation, then we can very quickly come to the conclusion that possibly this person might be interested in a monument to him. If he's old and sick and dying and wealthy, he might be interested in a monument. And we're in an excellent position to provide that for him because we can offer to name the shopping center after that person. You see, they didn't want the same thing. The buyer wanted the equity in the property. The seller really wasn't interested in that so much as he was the monument concept. And eventually, the investor didn't need the syndication that he had put together because the owner of the land was willing to deed the land over to him free and clear in return for a share in the syndication that they put in trust for the man's granddaughter and the promise that the shopping center would be named after him. That's a win-win solution, but it can only come when you understand that people don't want the same thing. In another instance, a man called me from Dallas. He was interested in acquiring a small business. He'd been negotiating with the sellers of the business. He found they were fairly flexible in terms of the terms on the property. They didn't necessarily need a lot of cash out of it, but they were fairly rigid on the price of the property. And he called me to see if I had any solutions to get the price down. So I said, well, quit telling me about the business. Tell me about the people. And he said, well, they're a middle-aged couple, the teenage children. That's really about all I know about them. I said, well, they do need some cash out of the business. Is that right? Oh, yes, they've asked for at least $4,000 cash. I said, well, what are they going to use that money for? He said, well, that, they told me. Their daughter's going into private college this fall, and they need $4,000 for tuition money in September. Now, let's get around the other side of the negotiating table with the understanding that we can do things for them that won't take away from our position because we don't necessarily want the same thing. And think about their problem. They're scraping together $4,000 to pay tuition this September. What will they need next January? Another $4,000 for the second semester, right? Does it make any sense for them to put their daughter into private university in September if they're not sure that they could maintain the tuition for the second semester? Of course not. They'd be better off to put her in a state university. What will they need the following September? Well, another $4,000, maybe a little more. And the following January? In fact, they're going to need $4,000 each September and January for the next 4 years. Now we're concerned about their problem, and what the investor in Dallas worked out was that he would work out the carryback financing so that it paid out a lump sum of $4,000 each September and January for the next 4 years, thereby assuring them that their daughter could go through college. You see, they didn't want the same thing. He wanted the equity in the business. They wanted the assurance that their daughter could go through college. And win-win negotiating can only come when you understand that people don't want the same things in the negotiation. So good negotiating becomes not just a matter of getting what you want, but also a matter of concern about the other person getting what they want. Now, please don't confuse negotiating with price cutting. A speaker told me, well, I don't negotiate my speaking fees. Well, if you have a product that is non-negotiable in terms of price, you had better become a very good negotiator. A store owner told me, our prices are fixed. We don't negotiate them. But you still negotiate. If you're trying to sell things at full price, you very definitely need to become a good negotiator. Conversely, a salesperson with an 8% negotiating range who gives it away all the time is not negotiating at all, is he? So don't confuse negotiating with price flexibility. In fact, many of the speaking engagements I have are from companies who are concerned about the lack of negotiating that their people are doing, not the amount of negotiating that their people are doing. I was hired by a large company in San Francisco, one of the largest suppliers of sound equipment to radio stations and television stations. They had given their salespeople an 8% negotiating range. Off of their list price, they could give up to 8%, and they found out that they were giving just about all of it. After we'd spent a day with them in a special workshop session teaching them negotiating, they were able to cut that price loss in half. So to someone with no flexibility in price negotiations, it becomes a matter of getting them to say yes. Yes, yes, yes. You can get them to say yes. Doesn't that word have a sweet ring to it? Some of the most exciting things that have ever happened to me have happened just after somebody has said yes. So what is the word no? To a good negotiator, no is simply an opening negotiating position. And the next time you make a proposal to someone and they say to you, that's the most outrageous idea I have ever heard, you must be out of your mind to think that we would go along with something as incredible as that, you simply say to yourself, isn't that an interesting opening negotiating position? In our next session together, we'll show you how progressing through the 3 specific stages of every negotiation will help lead you to a yes answer.
This is the end of Side 1. Side 2 is already queued up for your listening.
In this session, we'll be talking about the 3 stages of every negotiation and also the ingredients that make you a good negotiator. The 3 stages may not be apparent to you. In this country, we have a real desire to get to the bottom line, don't we? You know, Americans are probably the best salespeople in the entire world. When you're at New Delhi Airport, for example, which is the crossroads airport of the entire Asian continent, and you stand there and you see this long line of Boeing 747 airplanes coming down the runway, you know that Americans have to be the greatest airplane salespeople in the world. When you're in a country like Singapore and you see the entire budget of the nation being run on IBM computers, you know that American salespeople have to be the best computer salespeople in the world. And understand that Caterpillar tractors are used all over the world, even in Russia, for road building, so you know that we have to be the best equipment salespeople in the world. So we're good at what we do in negotiating business contracts. This was really highlighted to me recently when I took a tour of the United Nations building in New York. When the United Nations was established, it was agreed that the member nations would support the cost of the United Nations organization in relationship to their gross national product and their population. And a very wide range was established of support. But you know, we have one failing, and that is that we want to go to the bottom line too quickly. I really became aware of this when, as a real estate broker in California, president of one of the largest companies in California, we did a lot of business with Iranians. At the time of the fall of the Shah of Iran, it was not uncommon to find Iranians coming into this country with $1 million in cash that they would invest in American real estate. And very often I would see our salespeople making gross errors of negotiation with these Iranians, because they would take the typical American attitude that, well, let's get the business settled and we'll go out for a beer afterwards, whereas Iranians were taking a totally different approach. They knew that there were set stages that you need to go through in every negotiation. And it was appropriate to sit down and have some tea together, and get to know each other well for maybe several hours before the topic of business would even be raised. So if we will learn these 3 stages of every negotiation and learn to work with them, we'll become much more effective. So let's learn these 3 stages of every negotiation now. This is something that Mayor Wilson Goode of Philadelphia could really have benefited from. In May of 1985, he was called into a terrorist situation on Osage Avenue in Philadelphia. An upshot of the negotiations were that 53 homes were destroyed, 250 people were left homeless, and the 11 terrorists were left dead. This situation was of especial interest to me because not long before that, I had been hired by the mayors of California to teach them how to negotiate this kind of situation. There are 442 cities in California, and the mayors held a big conference in Monterey, California, and hired me to come and teach them how to negotiate. So I taught them that there are 3 stages of every negotiation. And I think the way that I explained it to them in terms of a terrorist situation will make it readily apparent to you what those 3 stages are and how you can apply them to any other negotiation. Let's suppose, I said to them, that you are the mayor of a small California city and you've been called into a terrorist situation downtown. There's a gunman holding a gun on a hostage in one of the buildings down there. Your police chief is a little to the right of Genghis Khan. He's in favor of blowing the whole place apart and killing everybody in sight. And you'd like to avoid that. Somebody hands you a bullhorn and says, okay, negotiate our way out of this. One of the mayors called out. He said, wait a minute, I only got elected by 47 votes. But in that situation, it would be fairly obvious what your first stage should be. Your first stage would be to establish criteria. Find out exactly what the other side wants to do. Even when you're fairly sure that you won't like what you're about to hear, find out exactly what it is they want. In the terrorist situation, it might be 5 minutes on a local radio station. It might be a one-way ticket to Cuba. It might just be something that you can give them. Sometimes you're surprised when you narrow it down to find out exactly what it is that they want. I remember a situation many, many years ago when a large department store chain asked me to negotiate a situation where a couple had bought a Franklin stove through their catalog department, had installed the stove, and it had malfunctioned, blackening the entire outside of their house and pouring hot coals onto their living room carpet and burning a hole in the middle of it. This appeared to be such a major problem to this company that the complaint had gone through all the stages, from salesperson to store manager to district manager to regional manager. The regional vice president in charge of the 7 western states now had this problem on his desk. In an attempt to negotiate this, to avoid it going on to the head office in Chicago, he asked me to go and see what could be done, to take pictures of the damage to assess an appropriate settlement. I went out there to this little home out in the country and met with the owners of this home, with 2 of the most charming elderly people I have ever met. I quickly ascertained that it was indeed the fault of the stove and not the way that they had installed it. They showed me the blackened outside of the house. They showed me the hole in the living room carpet. And the first thing I did was to establish criteria, to try and find out exactly what it was they wanted to do. I assumed it was a question that had been asked them a dozen times before, as this complaint had worked its way up through the levels of authority in the company. But to my amazement, when I said to them, well, what exactly is it you feel the company should do for you? They said, well, we can probably take care of the smoke on the outside of the house. We have plenty of time. We can clean that up. But we are concerned about the hole in the living room carpet. Well, what, I repeated, do you feel the company should do about that? Well, we wouldn't expect you to buy a whole new carpet, they said. Maybe if we had a scatter rug that we could put over the hole, that would be all right. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. I said, you mean to tell me that if we gave you a scatter rug to put over the hole, you'd be happy? Oh, yes, that would be fine, they said. So I put them in the car, drove them down to the local branch of the store, had them pick out a scatter rug, which was, I think, less than $50 at retail price, much less cost, had them sign a complete release, and send it in to the regional vice president of this company. And I got a letter back congratulating me on a masterful job of negotiating, which was nonsense. I was just the first person who had asked them exactly what they want to do. So that's always the first stage in any negotiation. In the terrorist situation, we ask them exactly what they expect us to do. Secondly, we create our criteria in their minds. We tell them exactly what we are prepared to do to ascertain how far we might be apart in the negotiations. Having established criteria so that each side understands exactly what the other side is initially willing to do, then we go to stage 2, which is to get information. This is one of the most critical parts of any negotiating process, is to find out exactly all you can about the other side. We'll see in session 7 how information is one of the critical elements of power. We'll see in session 8 that is one of the 3 critical elements that always affects the outcome of negotiation. But here we see it's the second stage of every negotiation. Find out all you possibly can. Don't jump to conclusions at this stage. Ask for information. In the case of the terrorist situation, we'd want to know, is this person a member of an organized group? Have they ever followed through on this threat before? What religion are they? Is the minister or a priest that we can call in? Where is their family? Who can we bring in to help us with the situation? But get all the information you possibly can. As an employer, you may have a key employee who's about to quit. You would still go through these 3 stages. Number 1, establish exactly what they intend and plan to do. What exactly would it take for them to stay with the company? Find out, even if you may not like what you're going to hear. And the second stage, get all the information you possibly can. And the more you probe for information, the more things will come to the surface that affect the negotiations that you otherwise would not be aware of. This employee may be having marital problems that seem to demand to him that he should leave town. And really, the dissatisfaction with the job is not the key issue at all. Getting more information is critical to you, and it's the second stage of every negotiation. Only when you've completed these 2 stages do you then go to stage 3, which is to reach for compromise. To start looking for things that they might see of value that you're willing to concede in the negotiation because they're not necessarily of value to you, and vice versa. Follow those 3 stages of negotiation. Practice in little areas, too. For example, my son used to come to me and say, "Dad, could I borrow the car tonight?" And I might immediately jump to the defensive. Without going through the stages, I'll say, "No, son, I don't want you borrowing the car tonight. We can't have you borrowing the car every night. You've got homework to do," and so on and so forth. If I'd have gone through the 3 stages, I would have said, establish criteria, number 1. Find out where he's going with the car, how long he's going to be, when will he be coming back. And then go to stage number 2. Get all the information you possibly can. Who's he going to be with? If he's going to a movie, what movie is he going to see, and so on. And then 3, reach for some kind of compromise that's acceptable to both of you, such as, if you do your homework first, I'll let you go. Or possibly tomorrow night I'll let you go to the movie and I'll come with you. But before I went through the 3 stages, I would jump to a conclusion, a big argument would start, and then I would find out that he'd been asked by his mother to go down to the drugstore and pick up a prescription for her. And the relationship would have been seriously weakened. What does it take to become a good negotiator? There are 5 things that I'd like to stress here. Number 1, the understanding that negotiating is always a 2-way affair. The pressure is always on the other person to compromise in the negotiations just as much as it is on you. For example, when you're walking into a bank to apply for a loan, you tend to get very intimidated. You tend to look at that big bank and you start thinking, why on earth would a big bank like this want to lend little old me money? And we immediately lose sight of the pressure that's on the other side, that this bank spends millions of dollars a year in advertising to try and entice us to come in for a loan. The many, many people who work there, their jobs are entirely dependent on the loan activity. So a good negotiator learns to mentally compensate for the fact that we always think we have the weaker side in the negotiations. And as he strides up to that loan officer's desk, he thinks to himself, I bet this loan officer just got a royal chewing out from his boss who told him, if you can't find somebody to lend money to today, we don't even need you around here anymore. One of the things that I recommend you do after taking this home study course is to go apply for an increase in pay. They've been underpaying you for years, and you didn't understand it. And maybe a lack of negotiating caused you not to be able to get what you really deserve. Now, you'll be sitting there with your boss negotiating an increase in pay, and you'll automatically start thinking that you've got the weaker hand, that they don't need to compromise as badly as you do. You'll be thinking, boy, I hope this doesn't affect my career plan with this company. They've really been good to me over the years. Maybe I shouldn't push so hard. Do you know what your employer is sitting there thinking? They're thinking, I hope I don't lose them over this. They have done so well for us in all these years. They are so skilled at what they're doing. I have no idea where I'd ever find a replacement for them. You're both sitting there thinking that you have the weaker hand in the negotiation, and good negotiators learn to mentally compensate for that. Point number 2 that makes you a good negotiator is the desire to acquire the skills of negotiating. The understanding that negotiating isn't just for union negotiators and FBI agents and prison wardens. Everybody's negotiating all the time, and the desire to acquire the skills comes from the understanding of how effective this knowledge that we're teaching you now, and the tactics that we'll be teaching you in sessions 3 and 4, and the personality styles and the power factors, how effective these can be when you're dealing with other people. Try them out. See how effective they are. Number 3, the understanding of how these different principles work and how the gambits that we'll cover in session 3 and 4 affect the negotiations. Number 4 is a willingness to practice. One of the fascinating things about learning how to negotiate is that you don't have to wait until you're in a heavy negotiating situation with thousands of dollars on the table before you work with these skills. Learn to practice in little areas, too. For example, I was recently hired to do a seminar in Atlanta at John Portman's Peachtree Hotel. It's a Western hotel. It's a fabulous place. It's the tallest hotel in the country and possibly in the world, I think. It's 70 stories high. It's like a round, tall tower. There are only about 20 rooms on each floor. As I walked into the hotel, a room had been prearranged for me by the organization that had hired me. I was wondering what could I do to provide an illustration to the people who will be in the seminar tomorrow of how effective negotiating can be. And what I determined to do was see what I could do about negotiating down the price of the room. Now, rooms at the Peachtree typically cost $135, and they had placed me in at a very good corporate rate, $75. But nevertheless, I determined to see what I could do. 10 minutes later, they had reduced the price of that room to $37.50 for me. I'd used the classic trade-off movement on them. They told me that they only had a twin-size room for me. Now, if they'd have said they only had a full-size room, I would have asked for a twin bed, you understand. It didn't matter what it was. But I said, I'm sorry, this room was booked a month ahead of time for me. I'm just not going to accept a twin-size room. The manager was bought out. He explained that they have 1,400 rooms in the hotel, 1,390 of them are already occupied, they only had 10 available, and I would have to settle for a twin-size room. So I used the trade-off technique. I said, well, I might be willing to settle for a twin-size room, but if I do that for you, what will you do for me? I thought possibly they might offer me a free breakfast or something like that. But to my amazement, he said, well, we might be able to adjust the price of the room a little bit. How would half price be for you? And I said, that would be just fine. Now, the interesting thing was that before they gave me the key to the room, they said, let me check just a moment. We may be able to do something more for you. And they made a telephone call, and they found out that they did indeed have a queen-size room available for me that had just been newly redecorated, and they were not sure whether it was being released yet for use. So I ended up getting a queen-size room, a $135 room, for only $37.50. This didn't benefit me, since the organization was paying for it, and they got the benefit of the reduction anyway. But the point is here that in little areas like this, you can learn to use these gambits to see how effective they can be. And that will be very, very useful for you when you get into large negotiations. In another instance recently, I was completing a seminar in Kansas City and flying back through Dallas to California. And another speaker at the seminar found that he was on the same flight as me and suggested we travel together. Well, in the taxi to the airport, I found out that I was traveling on a first-class ticket and he had a coach ticket. So I determined to see if I could get him upgraded to first class at no extra charge. Well, it took me 10 or 15 minutes to do it, which probably wasn't a particularly valuable investment of my time, but the thing is to get some practice in areas like this doing it. I asked the young lady at the counter, and I told him I'd just run into this friend of mine, and I had a first-class ticket. Would they be nice enough to give him a courtesy upgrade? She said that she couldn't do it, but that I should check with the gate agent and see if he could do it. So we talked to the gate agent. He said no, there was absolutely no way that the company would let him do that. I said, well, what if I talked to the stewardess on the airplane? He said, well, I guess you could talk to her if you wanted to. So I got onto the plane, and I told the same story over again. I just met this person. I had a first class. He had a coach. Would she be willing to look the other way? Well, she said, well, I don't have the authority, but I'll check back with the gate agent, the person I'd previously spoken to. I invited my friend to sit next to me in first class while she went to check. She came back, and she said, that'll be fine. You're welcome to do that. The interesting thing was that in both of these negotiations, the other people were not hostile to the negotiation. They were happy to do this. They were happy to make that concession. In fact, when my friend left the plane in Dallas, the stewardess pressed 2 little bottles of Chivas Regal into his hand and said, please take these without compliments. So that's one of the benchmarks of a good negotiation that we'll talk about in session 12, that you haven't completed a good negotiation if the other person resents what you accomplished. They must feel good about what was done. The fifth thing that makes you a win-win negotiator is the desire to create win-win solutions. After you've studied this course thoroughly and applied the techniques, you'll develop a power over people, a feeling of control in formally threatening situations that'll benefit you for a lifetime. Then it's up to you not to abuse that power, but only to use it when both people can benefit. In session 3, we'll talk about the specific negotiating gambits that make negotiating such a fascinating art.
This concludes the first cassette in Roger Dawson's program on power negotiating. We hope you'll profit from the ideas you've learned. And please remember that all the good ideas on this first cassette are just the start of the many good ideas in the complete power negotiating program. You've just heard 2 sessions. There are 10 more in this 6-cassette series. Plus, you get 24 pocket flashcards. They help remind you of Roger Dawson's negotiating secrets when you're out on the firing line in actual negotiating situations. It could be when you're buying or selling a car, asking for a raise or promotion, dealing with a tough business customer, or even negotiating with your teenager. In fact, Roger Dawson's negotiating secrets can help you be more successful in almost all aspects of your life. We're sure you'll benefit from this 6-cassette program. Simply return the reply card enclosed with this cassette, and we'll rush this program to you. For even faster service, credit card users can call the number printed on this cassette, 1-800-323-5552. Thanks again for your interest in Roger Dawson's Power Negotiating. We hope you'll give us the opportunity to send you the entire program. Thanks for listening.